Welcome, everyone, back to the podcast. I am Charles, joined here with
Maya.
And today we are going to be talking about international relations. More specifically, international law, its importance and its flaws. International law is important to understand as it's very different from the kind of laws we have here in the U.S. The American laws follow sort of like a hierarchy where you have the Constitution, federal laws, state laws, county laws, and stuff like that. International law does not have that. Sovereign nations can agree on certain statutes and civil conduct, but there isn't any body of international law superior to them. Louis Henkin, founder of the study of human rights law, composed the famous quote, "Almost all nations observe almost all principles of international law and almost all of their obligations almost all of the time." A special emphasis on the words almost there, because for the most part they do. There's generally a lot of peace, at least if we look at just the UN nations, there's a lot of peace there, and they do try to resolve their conflicts peacefully, except for when they don't. It's important to kind of like learn the separation between international law and the UN, because the UN sort of serves to give the nations inside of it a way to communicate and resolve conflicts peacefully without having to resort to armed conflict. So, but the things that they talk about they aren't legally binding. What is legally binding is the UN Security Conference. I think it's Security Conference. What happens there is legally binding. There are 15 spots. There are 5 permanent slots and then 10 temporary slots. The 5 permanent slots are held by the US, France, UK, China, and Russia. And for anything for any like law or decision to be made, it has to be consented to by all 5 of those permanent seat holders. But if we take in the case of Russia, in the current war in Ukraine, if any of the other countries propose something condemning their invasion, they can just veto it because they're on one of the permanent slots. So it's not a foolproof system to like abolish all military conflict.
Right, and the Russia-Ukraine war is very difficult to understand in terms of international law. It's a very complex war, and it's recently become very popular in what we consume as media. But it's been going on for a long time. So to just give a little bit of history of the state of Ukraine, it was a large part of the USSR during the early and mid 20th century. They were very powerful in terms of military and, yeah. So, but in 1991, they became a sovereign nation. And after gaining independence, they worked to build their market economy, and it generally worked out for them. They did have an increase in their GDP, and if you ignore the whole like Great Recession thing, they were doing pretty well. In 1999, Boris Yeltsin stepped down from his presidency of Russia. He was the president of Russia. And he did this pretty abruptly and appointed his prime minister, Vladimir Putin, as the new president of Russia, starting his term in 2000. As Putin took power in Russia, a leader by the name of Viktor Yanukovych was working his way up to become the governor of the Donetsk province of Ukraine. And after his time as governor, he ran for presidency in 2004 and lost. But he was appointed as the prime minister to the winner of the election, Viktor Yushchenko. And so yeah, he served as prime minister for 6 years until he ran again for presidency in 2010 and won. making him president of Ukraine. So Yanukovych was infamously very pro-Russia. He was not exactly what a lot of Ukraine was looking for at the time, and he was not in favor of the European Union, which is kind of what made him so disliked. He did not want to sign an agreement to have relations with the European Union, and this upset a lot of people, leading to protests. These protests were very large. There were many of them in 2013 and 2014, which is kind of the real start to this conflict, to the war itself. And so this time period is actually referred to as the Revolution of Dignity. And the protests were meant to be very peaceful, but once military became involved, it became very violent. People died because of these protests. So Yanukovych attempted to sign a peace treaty of sorts, promising to investigate the crimes committed against protesters. And he that wasn't good enough, because it wasn't good enough compensation in the eyes of the protesters. Yanukovych was actually he lost his presidency. He was removed as president through the revolution, which led into the Russian-Ukraine war in 2014. So that is the original start of this war. In February of 2014, Russia began to invade Crimea, which violated the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and
which they said that they would never do.
Yes,
ever
they
again.
said they would never do it. And basically this is a treaty of, we're respecting your borders, we're respecting your territory, we recognize you. Obviously, violating that upset even more people.
Treaties are a very important part of national law, because there are a lot of treaties that are observed and followed by a lot of nations, like the Geneva Convention. There are so many more. Countries are free to back out of them, and they kind of are when they violate them. But for the most part, they tend to observe them. It's kind of goes back to the almost always statement. Treaties aren't always they aren't always violated, but they do serve as like, this is our agreement. Let's agree to be good. So that's one of the biggest, most important parts about international law.
Yeah, for sure. So they began to invade Crimea, and then Crimea is the peninsula in South Ukraine. And then by the spring of the same year, they began to invade eastern Ukraine, thus starting the invasion. Fast forward to 2019, a man by the name of, I'm gonna butcher his first name, so I'm not gonna attempt it, but Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, he ran an interesting campaign, because he was a Ukrainian actor and comedian, and he ran his entire campaign without anyone else until days before the election, and he ran it almost entirely on social media. He did not participate in debates. He did not really do any of the standard things you would do when campaigning. But he won, and he won off a pretty much virtual, run. So that was
pretty impressive.
Pretty impressive. So he is the current president of Ukraine. that leads us to February of 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And something we have to understand about the motive for Putin is that he is very fixated on the USSR, the Soviet Union, because he does not recognize Ukraine as a sovereign nation. He recognizes them as an extension of Russia. And he backs this up by mentioning that there are some Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, so that is the perfect equation for, creating this Soviet Union again.
He wants to rebuild the Iron Curtain.
Yes. Very scary. And then, so this war is ongoing at the moment. There is no technical end in sight, but things have been done. So, in November of 2022, the commission proposed creating a new structure to manage frozen and immobilized public Russian assets, investing them, and using the proceeds for Ukraine. So basically, this is a way to compensate, almost a way to provide reparations, but I don't know if that would be the correct term. And then on March 17th of 2023, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued 2 arrests in relation to the war in Ukraine. Them being against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova. They are both being charged with war crimes for the deportation of children from the occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. According to the ICC, there is enough evidence to charge Russia with crimes of aggression, such as war and genocide. However, because Russia is not a state party to the ICC, no charges can be made at this time. And again, honestly, in the foreseeable future. But yeah, that's what has happened recently in terms of how do we go about solving this conflict?
Yeah, it's nice to see that the International Court did a thing. Like, they usually take a long time. They're not quick, from my understanding.
Not at all.
When they respond to these things that happen. So it is good that we are seeing accountability be held.
It's just not coming from Russia.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah,
but will we see that soon? Probably not. So obviously, Putin has been president for 23 years as of right now. And he has announced that he is running for president again in 2024. That's the next Russian election. So that will determine what happens with this conflict. Yeah, because it's sadly very much up to him, because he's...
Yeah, and I find it... I do find that very interesting. Because... I don't remember where I heard this. I heard this somewhere. That it was in that when it was before Zelensky in Ukraine, when Russia was trying to keep, because Zelensky is very Western focused. He's a very like how he did his campaigning. He's very Western focused on. I remember hearing that there was they hacked their. Or they were going to try to hack their election or do some twisting of things in some way to make it seem like people wanted the more Russian leaders there than the more Western ones, and Russia created publications talking about it. Mm-hmm. But that's not what happened. There was a very small majority that actually was doing what they were going to say was that the majority was. So there's a lot of dishonesty and not very democratic of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that I just want to note, I guess, is that because Russia is so hard to comply with, a lot of the aid that is being given to Ukraine is coming from outside countries, right? Countries that are not involved in this war as deeply. But one thing that Zelensky did a lot during the very beginning in 2022 and continues to do is he communicates with not only his people of his country, but he is working to communicate with other countries. He showed a video at the United Nations conference that highlighted a lot of the death and a lot of the destruction of Ukraine and of their civilians. And I think that that is exactly what we needed to see to understand the conflict. So Zelensky is an interesting leader, but I think he's doing a good job at letting us know what's actually happening. Because that's something we as, people recording this podcast in my basement in Minnesota don't really have, we're not able to understand. So I think a lot of aid or a lot of this resolution it could be coming from other countries. Yeah.
And that's, again, those international relations with how, that's an example of a very good way to go about trying to at least get help and, put things out there, because Zelensky is a very good, and he's very good at being very modern with how he presents stuff, and that's it's worked well. It's worked well for him.
Yeah.
So good on him for that.
Yeah. Before we issue any final remarks, I would like to state that we are not taking an opinion on this because it is not our place. There is really no opinion, but people are people. But we are not taking an opinion. We recognize the privilege we have, and we just encourage more research. We encourage finding good sources and journalists that are working really hard to cover this issue from the inside, because that's all we can do as citizens. And I think that's a great first step. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's very, and without the people that are actually over there, you said, the journalists that are actually collecting this information, we wouldn't be able to have to just recall this research from the internet and so easily educate ourselves on it. So we are very thankful for that, and it's just we can't even begin to comprehend what it's like. But at least through their work, we are able to at least have somewhat of an idea.
Yeah, exactly.
And it all goes to show the importance of international law and why it is important, because it really is. It really is. It's not perfect, and it has its flaws, but we do need it.
And like we talked about in class, lack of a court is anarchy. And to put it simply, lack of a court to make decisions for the people is anarchy. And depending on how you view anarchy, generally we don't want it, because it's not going to be done right if we do it ourselves.
It won't create organized reform.
Yes, exactly. So just having that international court in place is preventing a situation like that between nations.
Better what we have now than nothing.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for watching our second podcast. Podcast number 3. Maybe. No sponsor this time, unfortunately. But, NordVPN, you know my email. All right, thank you for watching. See you guys later.